It was almost midnight when my phone buzzed against the desk, and I almost didn't look at it. I had been deep in a packaging mock-up for a small coffee roaster in southeast Portland, the kind of work that pulls you in completely and makes the rest of the world go quiet. And that small glow felt like an interruption I didn't need. But I reached for it anyway. The way you reach for something without thinking. And what I saw stopped my hand midair. It was an automated transfer alert from our joint account. The name on the receiving end wasn't a utility company, wasn't a mortgage payment, wasn't anything I recognized. Garrett Consulting Solutions. I set the phone down on top of the mock-up I'd spent 3 hours on and sat very still. The way you sit when your body understands something before your mind is ready to say it out loud. Pause 4S. I searched the name. Results came back in seconds. A business address in the Pearl District. Registered 8 months ago. Listed under a woman named Simone Garrett. I knew that name. Not from a confrontation. Not from any single moment I could point to. I knew it the way you know a song that's been playing softly in another room for months. Just beneath the level where you stop and ask what it is. I didn't cry. I didn't move from my chair. I found Lydia's name in my contacts. Pressed call. And when she picked up on the second ring, I said, "I need you to look at something with me." And my voice was so level that she paused before she answered. Looking back, the signs were never hidden. They were just placed in front of a woman who had decided, very deliberately, to keep looking straight ahead. Back in March, Brett started blocking off Tuesday and Thursday evenings on his calendar with nothing written inside them. No client name. No location. Just a gray rectangle that meant do not ask. I told myself it was a project phase. The kind that comes with pressure and requires a person to disappear for stretches at a time. And I believed it the way you believe something, when believing it costs less than the alternative. April was when the account started running lighter than it should have. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have triggered anything obvious. Just a quiet monthly erosion that I noticed and filed away under explanations I hadn't found yet. Then Owen sent me a text in early May that was clearly meant for someone else. Just one sentence. No context. Asking if Brett had signed something yet and whether it needed to happen before the end of the week. I read it twice, saved it without responding, and went back to the project I was working on. I didn't ask Owen what he meant. I didn't ask Brett either. What I did was start paying attention differently. Not louder. Not more desperately. Just more precisely. The way you adjust the focus on a lens when you realize the image was never actually blurry. You were just looking at the wrong distance. Carol was the one who finally gave me something I couldn't soften into a different shape. She texted me a screenshot one afternoon with no caption. No explanation. Just an image from a private Instagram account belonging to Simone Garrett. And in it, Brett was sitting across a table at Nob Hill Food and Drink, a restaurant he had told me twice was overpriced and not worth the drive. Pause 3S. I showed Lydia the screenshot the night she came over, and she didn't say anything for a moment. She set it down on the table, opened her laptop, and pulled up the business registration records for Garrett Consulting Solutions. And that was when she found the second name attached to the filing. Curtis Garrett, Simone's older brother, whose distribution company had just landed a logistics contract routed directly through Brett's approval queue. Lydia looked at me across the table and said, "She didn't stumble into his life." And I nodded once because I had already known that. I just needed someone else to say it first. What Lydia found next wasn't something you stumble onto by accident. She spent 2 evenings cross-referencing public business filings, contract award records, and the timeline of Brett's calendar blocks. And what emerged wasn't a love story with complicated feelings at the center of it. It was a structure. Simone had registered Garrett Consulting Solutions in January, 4 months before Brett's account activity started shifting, and Curtis had submitted his company's first bid for a logistics partnership contract the following month. The sequence wasn't coincidental. It was a runway. Simone had approached Brett at exactly the right moment. When he was feeling passed over at work, when he was the kind of tired that makes a man want someone to tell him he's more than what his current life reflects. She knew how to read that. She knew which door to walk through and how to leave it open just wide enough that he'd follow without feeling led. What Brett thought was a connection that had found him unexpectedly was something that had been aimed at him with considerable patience and precision. And he had no idea, because he was too busy believing he was finally being chosen. I sat with that for a long time the night Lydia laid it out in front of me. Not because it broke me open, but because it clarified something I had been trying to see clearly for months. Brett wasn't a man who had fallen. He was a man who had been guided into a fall by someone who needed him to land in a very specific place. And the house. The plan to sell it that he hadn't mentioned to me yet, but that I already knew was coming. That was part of it too. Pause 5S. I drove to Nathan Reed's office on a Wednesday morning in September and set my folder on his desk without small talk. He opened it, read the first 2 pages, and looked up with the steadiness of someone who has seen variations of this before but not quite this version. I told him I wasn't there to ask what I was entitled to. I told him I was there to make sure what I had built didn't get handed to someone who had planned this from the beginning. And Nathan nodded slowly and said, "Then let's start today." Oregon divides marital property based on what's equitable, not what's equal. And Nathan explained that distinction to me on our first real working session, with the kind of calm that comes from having said it many times before, to people sitting exactly where I was sitting. Equitable means the court looks at the full picture. Who contributed what? Who wasted what? And whether one party's behavior caused measurable harm to the marital estate. The transfers to Garrett Consulting Solutions, routed from our joint account over 8 months, gave Nathan exactly the kind of documented pattern he needed to argue marital waste on my behalf. And Lydia's records made that argument airtight before we ever stepped near a courtroom. Nathan filed the divorce petition in my name first, which mattered more than it might sound. In Oregon, the person who files establishes the procedural timeline, and that timing gave us the window to request a temporary restraining order preventing Brett from selling, transferring, or encumbering any jointly held asset while the case was pending. The house was the asset that mattered most, and by the time Brett came home that Friday evening with the look of a man rehearsing something in his head, the court had already signed off on that order 3 days prior. He didn't know it yet. I did. What I remember most about those 8 weeks is not the paperwork or the Tuesday afternoon meetings in Nathan's office on the 6th floor with the rain coming sideways off the river. What I remember is how ordinary everything looked from the outside. I cooked dinner. I asked Brett how his week was going. I slept in the same bed and woke up at the same time and drove the same route to the studio every morning. And none of it felt like performance because I had already made my decision and decisions. Once made cleanly, have a way of steadying everything around them. Lydia called me one evening after cross-checking the final set of records and said the number was bigger than she'd initially estimated. And I told her to document all of it. Every transaction, every date, every amount. Because I wanted Nathan to walk into that courtroom with something that didn't leave room for interpretation. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "You've been ready for this longer than you think." And I didn't disagree. Brett came home that Saturday evening with the particular energy of a man who had made up his mind about something and was looking for the right moment to say it out loud. Lydia and Carol were already at the table when he walked in, and he paused for just a half second at the sight of them before adjusting his expression back to neutral and setting his keys on the counter the way he always did. We ate for a while. The conversation stayed easy, surface level. The kind that fills a room without meaning anything. And I watched him the way I had been watching him for months. Quietly. From a place he couldn't see into. He set his fork down about 40 minutes in and leaned back in his chair with the body language of someone about to deliver news he had already framed as reasonable. He said he'd been thinking about the house, that the market was strong right now, that it made financial sense to sell while conditions were favorable, and that he thought they could split everything cleanly and move forward without it getting complicated. He said all of it, in the tone of a man who expected to be heard and agreed with. And when he finished, he looked at me the way people look at you when they think the hardest part is already over. I let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to. Then I pushed back from the table, walked into the studio, and came back with a thin blue folder that I placed beside his plate without a word. He looked at it, then at me, and I said, "The court signed that 3 days ago. You can't sell, transfer, or touch anything we own jointly until this case closes." And the way his face changed in the next few seconds told me everything about how certain he had been that he was the only one in this marriage who had been planning ahead. Pause 4S. Lydia didn't look up from her glass. Carol kept her hands folded in her lap. Brett opened the folder and read the first page. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. He finally looked across the table and said, "When did you do this?" Not as a question, but as something closer to a reckoning. And I held his eyes and said, "Before you decided to." Everything that followed moved the way damage actually moves. Not in one loud wave, but in a slow, widening series of consequences that touched every person who had been part of what Brett and Simone had built together. The week after that Saturday dinner, I submitted a formal conflict of interest complaint to Brett's company's HR department. Not about the affair, which was their private business, but about the documented pattern of a director using his contract approval authority to benefit a vendor whose principal was his personal partner. HR had a fiduciary obligation to investigate that, and they did. Simone was placed on administrative leave within 10 days. She didn't wait for the outcome. She resigned before the review concluded, which told the investigators everything they needed to know about how confident she was in her own position. Curtis lost the logistics contract when the procurement office flagged the relationship and reopened the bid process to other vendors. And without that contract, his company's cash flow couldn't hold through the quarter. Pause 3S. Brett was demoted out of his director role within 6 weeks, stripped of his contract approval authority, and reassigned to a position with no procurement oversight. 3 months after that, during a company restructuring, his name was on the list they didn't keep. Simone stopped returning Brett's calls sometime around the point when it became clear that the house wasn't going anywhere and the contract was gone, and there was no longer anything in the arrangement worth maintaining. That was the part Brett hadn't seen coming. The part where the thing he thought was real turned out to have been tied entirely to the thing he could no longer deliver. Owen sent me a text that said he was sorry he hadn't said something sooner. And I wrote back 2 words and left it there because 2 words was all it warranted. Carol never called Brett to explain herself and never offered an apology for the screenshot she'd sent me, because she didn't believe one was owed. Brett moved into a rental on the east side of the city, the kind of place he used to describe as temporary when other people lived in them. I heard through Lydia that he'd been reaching out to mutual acquaintances, trying to reframe the story. But the people who mattered already knew which version was documented and which one wasn't. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday morning in March, and I signed the last page in Nathan's office with the same steady hand I had used on every document before it. The court's ruling reflected what Lydia's records had made undeniable, that a significant portion of our marital assets had been redirected without my knowledge, and the equitable distribution adjusted in my favor accordingly. I kept the house. Not because the court handed it to me, but because I had spent 8 months making sure the record showed exactly who had been maintaining it while the other person was planning to sell it out from under me. I painted the front door that weekend. A deep slate blue I had been looking at in a swatch book for 2 years, without ever pulling the trigger on because Brett thought it was too bold for the neighborhood. I changed the name on the mailbox. I moved my drafting table into the room that used to be his home office. Better light. More space. And the first morning I sat down to work in there, I didn't feel triumphant so much as accurately located. Like I had stopped living slightly to the left of where I actually belonged. Pause 5S. Lydia helped me set up the accounts for the studio I launched under my own name that spring. Fully mine. No agency attached. And the first month's income covered half the mortgage on its own. Nathan and I started meeting for coffee on Friday mornings. Not as attorney and client anymore, but as two people who had more to talk about than paperwork. And I let that be whatever it was, without needing to name it ahead of schedule. Carol sent me a short text in April that said she was glad I was okay, and I wrote back that I was better than okay, which was the most accurate thing I had said in a long time. I opened the studio windows each morning and let the Portland air come through. And I sat with my coffee in the quiet of a life that finally had only one person in charge of it. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. Some of it came from a place closer to home than I usually let on. And if any part of it landed for you, I'd love to know in the comments. You don't have to have lived this exact version to recognize the feeling of finally choosing yourself.